We know that Gina Rinehart is Australia's richest person. What about the Wright family? Are they rich? They must have a fair bit of money if they're affording all these lawyers.
Yes, they certainly are. They're not Gina rich. They're only in the single-digit billions, sadly for them, as opposed to the double-digit billions. And even if they win this case emphatically, and that's a big if, this won't move the needle dramatically for Gina. She would drop from 34 billion, give or take, to around sort of 32, and the Wrights would nudge up a couple of billion between them. But the Wright family are very low profile. The surviving daughter of Peter, Angela Bennett, is perhaps our most reclusive billionaire. She's deliberately and purposefully avoided the public spotlight for years. For decades, we actually didn't really know what she looked like until I actually managed to find a photo of her at a social function many years ago, and we called her the night parrot of Australian billionaires because sightings of her were so rare and unusual. So she's certainly kept a low profile. The Bennetts and the Wright family have never really chased the public spotlight. Gina, she has a public profile, but it's very carefully maintained. She keeps a lot of distance from the media generally. So that's what's also made this case so interesting, is that it's such a rare opportunity to really look behind the curtain of these big, important, but quite secretive businesses and get a sense for how they interact with one another, how they view one another. And this week it's almost been like watching a bit of history in a sense.
So what's this case about from her point of view, do you think? As you say, it wouldn't necessarily cost her that much to just settle it, make it go away.
Yes. Look, one thing I've learned, I guess, about all billionaires is they never take the simple option generally, and even though they will often say that money doesn't motivate them, they do fight pretty hard to hold on to it. But I suppose from Gina's point of view, this is a lot about proving that she was right. And I think also with this case, it was Gina who drove, in the case of Hope Downs, the process of getting the deals done to get these developed. Right, she was there slugging it out to get these agreements over the line, to actually bring these assets to production, which is a really big deal. So I think she probably feels like she's almost being taken advantage of here, that she would do the legwork to turn these into assets of incredible value, only to have the other side come along late in the piece once all the hard work is done and ask for their share of that. So I think it's more than just a financial thing for her. I think there's a lot of pride, and a lot of her values are really at the forefront of this case.
Have there been attempts to mediate this behind the scenes?
As I understand it, there have been. It's been 10 years to get to this trial. So in the meantime, I think there has been some court-ordered mediations through that process. There's been a lot of toing and froing over the merits of the case, elements of evidence that should be tendered, what should be confidential. There's other arbitrations that have been running in this matter and in other matters that have all been brought in together. So it's undoubtedly one of the most complex and long-running legal matters that I've ever seen.
What are the kind of stakes here for Australia, and what is this case kind of making you reflect on about iron ore significance, about the significance of this land to Indigenous people? That's a bit of a sweeping question, I know,
yeah.
But are Indigenous traditional owners even being mentioned in this court case?
There's been no mention whatsoever in anything that I've heard so far in that respect about where Indigenous Australians sit. That may perhaps come in later in the piece, because we spent the bulk of the case so far sifting through documents from the 60s and 70s and 80s, and we're just getting up into the 90s and 2000s now. So perhaps those issues will come to the fore, but certainly that's not what is at stake in this matter. So it would almost be an accident if that was to come up. But in terms of what this case said about Australia's economy more broadly. And I think there will be people who will look at this case and say, oh, why do we even care? This is just billionaires squabbling amongst themselves over their own fortunes. But it is of direct relevance to people more broadly. These are the assets that sustain the Australian economy. They're the assets that drive billions of dollars of taxation revenue. The assets that generate thousands of jobs, well-paying jobs, that give the Australian economy a point of differentiation. So much of our living standards, particularly over here in Western Australia, rely upon these assets. And what this case has shown with some of the historical documents that have been tendered so far is just, it's been quite eye-opening seeing those early pioneers of this industry grappling with the magnitude of what they'd found and trying to anticipate how big it could become, just what to do with that. These weren't, veteran mining executives. These weren't huge multinationals that have been doing this for decades. These were business people. They were educated business people, but really they had this enormous tiger by the tail, and trying to figure out what to do with it was an enormous challenge, and trying to figure out what to do with it in a way that wouldn't set into train enormous legal battles in the future certainly proved to be beyond them.
You have been stepping back into the 60s this week to experience kind of what it was like to be exploring this area back then. As far as you can tell, was there any engagement at all back then with the Aboriginal people who had looked after this land for thousands of years?
From what we've seen in the correspondence tendered to date, there's been no mention of that. That's not to say it wasn't happening. It certainly just has not come out in any way, shape or form in any of these discussions here. And these are discussions not just between the partners themselves, but between the partners and the state government, the mines minister with the premiers at the time. There was a letter that was sent to the Prime Minister as well. And certainly in that respect, no mention that we've heard of the Indigenous people in those areas. You wouldn't think that would be the case, certainly today, if this was happening again. This case is so big, the stakes are so high, and the party is so well resourced that it has really put a strain across the WA justice system. They've had to set aside the Supreme Court's biggest courtroom. They've actually had to reconfigure it slightly to make sure there's enough desk space for all the barristers who have been brought in for this matter. We've got 30 barristers in the courtroom, and when you think that their individual bills run into the thousands and sometimes around $15,000 a day, the cost of that legal firepower is immense. So we've watched each day as these banks and banks of barristers have rolled on in, filling the courtroom to capacity. Then there's the hangers-on and observers from various parties in the back of the courtroom as well. And at the head of it all, we've got Justice Jennifer Smith, who's overseeing this matter. And yeah, it's certainly been an immense amount of interest from the legal fraternity, from the companies themselves, as you'd expect.